Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
We often pass them in the streets without a second thought. Or perhaps they're holding up a sign asking drivers for money to feed themselves or their families. They are the homeless. You're listening to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. One estimate puts the number of people who are homeless in the United States at nearly 600,000. Another 30% of those without homes are experiencing chronic patterns of homelessness. Dr. Robert Okin is a psychiatrist who decided to take a journey onto the streets to discover who they are, and has resulted in a new book entitled Silent Voices, People with Mental Disorders on the Street, which includes individual accounts of their lives and experiences. And we recently interviewed him about what he found. What got you involved with going out on the street, not just simply studying this from afar, but actually meeting these people where they live?
When I left my position as chief at the hospital, one night I was kind of rushing to my car, and it was cold and windy and rainy, and I saw this little woman huddled up on the sidewalk trying to protect herself from the rain. I got into my car. I was dry and warm, and I felt like I kind of totally deserted her. I mean, I was leaving her there, and I couldn't get her out of my mind for weeks. And I couldn't imagine how she could bear the stresses and the privations and the suffering of the street day after day and night after night. I mean, it wasn't going to end. It wasn't like this was some short period in her life. So I decided I wanted to spend time on the streets meeting people who were homeless and probably mentally ill, and talk to them about their lives and ask them how they became homeless and what it was really like to live in their skin and walk in their shoes. So that's what I did. I approached people and asked if I could talk to them. And then I was so struck by the suffering and the way the suffering was etched on their faces that I decided to photograph them as they told me about their lives, because there was something about their faces that just conveyed more than even their words did. So that was the original impetus for the book. And I then decided that I needed to share these stories and photographs with a larger audience in the public so that they could really hear what the lives of these people were like. And I wanted to give the public a view of these people as human beings beyond their rags and their carts and their strange behaviors. And I hoped that by giving them a voice in the public domain, that I could convey their essential humanity really as a kind of counterweight to the fear and the hostility and the blame and indifference with which they're generally seen and treated. Because it became clear to me that as long as we don't see them as people, we'll never be able to identify with them or connect with them, and we'll continue to dehumanize them. And this is such a pernicious problem, because if we carry this view into the political arena, we'll continue to convey to our political leaders that we don't really care about these people, and that we won't hold our political leaders accountable for abandoning them, and the problem will never be solved. I really came to believe that humanizing them is the foundation for political action, and only this will let our political leaders know that we insist that they stop nibbling around the edges of the problem and really take action to solve it.
How did they respond to your presence, coming really from the outside, obviously, to you asking them about their lives?
Yeah, well, I have to say, I expected that they'd blow me off and refuse to talk to me, because I had no authority. I had certainly none of the authority of the doctor in the hospital with his white coat controlling the whole show. And I was just some dude with a knapsack and a camera, and I was basically asking them for a handout rather than the other way around. So, as I say, I found the opposite. They seemed genuinely pleased that I was interested in their lives. Most of these people had been neglected as children and feel invisible as people on the street because we keep looking away from them. And seeing that I was really interested in their lives seemed to mean a great deal to them, and they were willing to talk to me. I actually expected to find people with tough outer shells who were going to be difficult to connect with, but instead I found people who were exquisitely sensitive and very willing to talk to me, and talk to me with surprising candor and intensity and honesty about very personal and intimate issues in their lives. Most had tears in their eyes during much of the interviews. And God, I didn't expect that. I didn't expect to see that their grief was so close to the surface. I also expected them to blame their homelessness on something or someone else. But in fact, they tended to blame themselves, wrongly in my opinion, but that's what they did.
One of the quotes that really struck me was, "Life on the streets isn't easy, but it's not desperately hard. I'm sleeping on the streets and eating out of garbage cans. I have 2 or 3 spots that I sleep, but I don't want to say where." And there's almost a certain lyrical sense about where this person was, and almost an acceptance of their fate.
Yes, that's a very insightful view of that quote. There's almost a resignation that this is just the way their lives are going to be, and that they've got to make the best of it. So they somehow, kind of, I would say, persuade themselves that things aren't that bad. But my God, how did they do the mental connections to get to that place? Because if eating out of garbage cans and sleeping on the street isn't terrible, then I don't know what is.
The most other thing that really struck me are the stories of the women, and many of them talked about being sexually assaulted. I know Rebecca, for instance, said, "My mother must have known what my father was doing even before he raped me." And there seemed to be a lot of that for a number of these women who found themselves on the street.
That's true. About, I would say, 40% of the women that I interviewed told me that they had been sexually abused as children, and many of them had been sexually assaulted on the streets, because particularly for a woman, living on the streets is a dangerous proposition.
In terms of their relationships with other people, one of the quotes I saw was that it was difficult to have any kind of relationship with other people. I think it was Donna said that it's hard having a relationship when you're living on the street. I mean, there is a lack of connection that when we think about, particularly for women who have families and children and so on, and yet here these women, they're so isolated and they find it difficult to have this connection that perhaps many women in the society have.
That's very true. In fact, some of the women that I met basically were on the street because they had escaped from abusive relationships. And so the last thing they wanted was to connect with some other guy and find themselves in exactly that same position again. So they tended to keep to themselves and they stayed away from everyone else. But then the downside of that was that in their attempt to create an illusion of safety for themselves, that had to then endure the isolation and the loneliness of not having any human connection.
I didn't see this in your book, but did you get any sense that the women themselves connected with one another?
I didn't see that, no. No, they seemed quite isolated, not just from men, but from each other.
The other group, of course, are the veterans that you talked to. Give me a sense about who they are. And it seemed to, particularly, I think one was from Vietnam, for example, a Vietnam veteran. What about them? There's been a lot of progress, apparently, trying to cut down on the homelessness when it comes to veterans.
Yeah, so, let's start with the progress because, I think people really need to recognize that this is a solvable problem. The idea that you can't do anything about it is just not true. So it's really important to recognize that in the last decade, homelessness among vets has decreased by 41%. It didn't just happen. It happened because the government decided, after being embarrassed by its failure to do anything for these vets, the government decided that it was going to put money into housing and services for them. And the result was predictably that their homelessness decreased dramatically. So this is not rocket science, and the progress we've made with vets and homelessness really demonstrates that. But to get back to the earlier part of your question, what's the story with these vets? How did they become homeless? Well, most of them became homeless because they came back from either Vietnam or now Iraq, and they were just deeply traumatized. Every time they heard a loud noise, they ducked for cover. And many of them tried to deal with their post-traumatic stress disorders by drinking or taking drugs, basically a kind of self-medicating. But that only made things worse for them, and many of them then really fell into the street because they couldn't work, partially because of their earlier trauma and partially because of the drugs they took to try to medicate themselves out of it. So they lost everything, including their ability to work. They became homeless, and you saw the result of that.
Repeatedly in these stories, you saw the role of both drugs and alcohol on these people's lives. That seems to be one of the common denominators, is if they're using these to escape from whatever it is that they have had in their past or even their current conditions. That seems to be one of the principal issues that face them.
That's true. For many of them, drugs and alcohol was the only way they could see to soften things for themselves. But of course, it only dug them deeper into the hole. But I have to say, and this is really important, the homelessness is a result of the interaction between individual factors like the fact that so many of these people had been abused or neglected as children, or had experienced trauma in the war and began taking drugs. Many of them never had a fighting chance right from childhood. Many of them had, some genetic predisposition to mental illness, which appeared in their adolescence or early 20s. So these are what you might call the individual factors that relate to the person themselves. But that's not what creates the homelessness crisis that we have today. What creates it is the systemic factors that push these people who are fragile into the streets. And the systemic factors are really things that government was ultimately and continues to be ultimately responsible for and should be on the hook for solving the problem. And I can kind of lay out a little why I hold government responsible for creating the crisis if you think your listeners would want to hear that.
Well, how do you think government has done that?
Well, it started in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when state governments dumped 600,000 mentally ill people onto the street with no services, no housing, no support. 600,000 mentally ill people. I mean, where were they going to go? Well, many of them ended up on the street. And to this day, 70 years after this, governments have still failed to create the kind of mental health and substance abuse services that could help treat these people with serious mental illness. And the result is that 40% of the homeless population has serious and untreated psychiatric disorders. And then to compound this, when the drug epidemic emerged in the 70s, governments at all levels failed to both stem the flow of drugs into the country and also establish substance abuse services that could help people who became addicted. So more people, as a result of these failures, slipped onto the street. And then, and I would say more fundamentally, the tax policies created by the federal government contributed to this problem in a huge way. The tax policies created huge disparities of wealth in this society, allowing 10% of the population to amass a huge amount of wealth. More than 50% of the bottom half of the population combined. And this set the stage for a huge increase in the homeless population. For the people at the very bottom of the income ladder were left with almost nothing. Government basically overstuffed and gorged the richest segment of the population through its tax policies, which inevitably meant that it had to starve the poorest segment. And the homeless population are really the true casualties of this huge disparity of wealth. And I think people, when they pass a homeless person on the street, they never think about what the systemic factors are. They never think, oh, this is really a casualty of the way government has distributed wealth in the society. So the government aggravated it further by keeping welfare payments on which they depend so low as to keep them impoverished forever. The federal government could have offset the impact of these policies by creating a robust safety net so that the casualties of their policies wouldn't fall off into the streets, so to speak, with one little financial reverse. But it didn't do this. Instead, when Reagan was president, he wasn't content when he was governor to have botched the institutionalization in California, but as president, he slashed the already limited federal support for low-income housing, and then coming up and promoting his kind of voodoo trickle-down economic policies, which pushed still more people into the street. But aggravating federal contribution to homelessness was the fact that city and state governments often created incentives that encouraged real estate moguls to convert low-income housing into condominiums that poor people couldn't possibly afford. In New York City, for example, I'm kind of remembering, in New York City alone, this led to the loss of 100,000 low-income apartments. So where were the people who had lived in these apartments going to go? Well, many of them became homeless. And in addition, city governments often gave tax breaks and other incentives to big tech companies, wooing them to settle within their borders, but then failing to adequately tax them for gobbling up the housing supply with their high-paid employees. So government's hand in creating homelessness, has got to be seen, because if it's not, then we think, homelessness is just kind of a fact of nature. It's kind of part of the natural order of things. But there's nothing natural about it. It didn't just happen. Government created the problem, and government needs to be on the hook for solving it. And we need to insist that our politicians solve it, because it is solvable. Homeless people need homes. Mentally ill people need treatment. It's not, as the success with veterans shows, it is not an unsolvable problem, but it means that governments need to really hear that we as citizens insist that they solve it. We're lucky to live in a democracy. We need to use it by speaking out and holding our political leaders accountable for doing what they need to do and what they can do to solve it.
I want to turn, by the way, to the shelters. I know there's one quote that says, living in this building with so many addicts and ex-addicts, it's a challenge. It's hard to keep my things safe here. Either they get stolen by other clients or by staff who have a key. And there does seem to be this inadequacy of these shelters, even when there are not enough of them as it is.
Yeah, well, it's very true what you're saying. A lot of people that I met said, I'd rather sleep on the street than in a shelter because, in a shelter, I'm sleeping 2 feet away from someone else, and I don't know what kind of disease they might have that I could catch. And, if I don't sleep with one eye open, then, stuff that I have is going to be stolen. I just don't want to take that chance. And the other thing they said about shelters is that many shelter policies mean that people in the morning are kicked out at about 6 o'clock, and then they have to kind of fend for themselves during the day, and then come back and stand in line often for hours to get into the shelter again because there's just not enough beds. So, many people said, it's just not worth it. I'm going to sleep on the street.
By the way, was there a situation that was really developed to be serious when it came to COVID? Because I understand that there was a serious problem in terms of how it spread. Here in Salisbury, for instance, there were efforts to separate people out, keep them at a distance, but nonetheless, it seems to have taken its toll.
Well, yeah, different cities handled the problem in different ways. I can say that San Francisco, when it discovered that was happening in the shelter, lo and behold, found other places for them. They rented hotel rooms and motel rooms and found, empty apartments. Somehow, when there was a political reason to do so, when they were afraid that COVID would spread from the homeless population in shelters into the general population, they somehow managed to find other places for these people to get out of the weather and out of the shelters. And it only showed that they could have done this before it became a kind of a public health crisis. So that's how it was handled in San Francisco, and I think handled well.
In terms of mental illness that you talk about, is this a product of their history, their individual histories, or is this a product of things that have traumatically happened to them even later in life? I think I saw where one said that they had been living in a house and now they were living in a cardboard box.
Well, the woman that you're mentioning who said that had been in an abusive relationship and finally extracted herself from it. But, she had no place to go but the streets, so she was living in a cardboard box. So I would say she was not an example of someone who had mental illness. She was an example of someone whose life as an adult, turned in this direction, and she had no place to go. So I would say it's a combination. Some people have mental illness because they were genetically predisposed to it, and even though they were deeply loved by their families, their mental illness, basically took over and trumped everything else, and they left their families for the streets. I think that's probably a minority. A majority of the mentally ill people that I spoke to seemed to have a genetic predisposition to it, but adding to that was real childhood adversity. And then adding to that was some reverse that they experienced as an adult. So it was often a combination of these things, a kind of compounding effect that led to their homelessness. But sometimes it was just, one or the other, and not all of them stacked up together. So different people had different dosages of these causes.
One of the questions that has struck me over the years in talking to people about homelessness, and that is, where are the extended families in all of this? Why isn't that they don't get at least some help? They may still be on the street, but that they seem to lose this connection to families, which most people seem to have.
Yeah. Well, that's very true. If you compare our society to, let's say, Italy, Italian families, by and large, really take care of their disabled members, and there's much less homelessness, partially as a result of that, partially as a result of the fact that people have a right to health care and housing and other services, but their families are critically important. In this society, there's so much social mobility and geographic mobility that people often lose contact with their families simply for that reason. But they also lose contact, as I said before, as a result of their mental illness and their drug abuse. And sometimes their families really try to help them, but their families get worn out because they get so little help from the government, and they ultimately are left kind of helpless to do anything. And then I think the more common reason that people lose contact with their families is, in a way, as children, they never really had contact in the first place. Yeah, they had physical contact, but they didn't have emotional contact. And when they grew up, they just left their families because their families had deserted them as children, and they learned through experience that they really couldn't count on them for anything else as adults.
By the way, do you get any sense that the number of these people found themselves, say, in the foster care system, where they've been separated from their families? Because I know that's one of the big issues, particularly with family courts.
Yeah, I was actually surprised at the percentage of mentally ill homeless people who were graduates, you might say, of the foster care system. Almost about 40 to 50% is the data that I've seen of homeless mentally ill people who had been in foster care. And, they ended up in foster care as children because their families were so neglectful or abusive of them. So again, you have this compounding effect of the abuse and neglect, and then the real problems in the foster care system. And then when they so-called aged out at age 18, by and large, they were just dumped out of the system, and about 20%, I think, became homeless on the day that they aged out because there was nothing for them.
Finally, do you have hope that government will respond either locally or nationally? It doesn't seem as if they're doing that, but what sense do you get about what the future holds here?
I think it was Margaret Mead who said, never, it's something like never forget that the voices of a small group of committed people can really bring about major change. She said it much more eloquently, but that's the idea. So I really believe that if we can insist that our political leaders do something, if there's a grassroots movement to make change, I think change will occur, but not until then. And if we don't raise our voices, if we don't call our political leaders, if we wait for the next guy to do it, it's not going to happen. And we'll be living with homelessness for the next 100 years. But if we do speak out, I don't have any question that government will listen, because politicians don't vote it out of office. And if they believe that people are insistent and angry enough to vote them out of office, if they don't do something, they will do something.
Dr. Robert Okin, a psychiatrist who has written a new book entitled Silent Voices, People with Mental Disorders on the Street. You're listening to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.